All right. Thank you for showing up this evening into another chapter. Now, this is going to be a talk on the wisdom of Heraclitus. Now, I'm using the word wisdom in the philosophical sense, and that's going to create, I hope, a problem, because normally it is not regarded true that Heraclitus has any concepts dealing with that realm of the divine intelligence called wisdom. Now, if I can make this point, then we have to see how is it that there's such a sharp difference between what most people regard as Heraclitus and his thought and what we'll be doing tonight. That is to say, there's a primary problem in hermeneutics, that is, how to interpret things. So, let me start. Of course, he was born during the 69th Olympiad. That puts him at around 500 to 504 BC. We only have fragments of his work, that's all we have, found in other authors' writings, and therefore they're scattered throughout ancient literature. People bring them all together into a unity and then write commentaries on them. I would like to make a point about what I think is what I call the 1-to-3, and sometimes it's 1-to-4 ratio. That is, in each of the subjects he's going to explore, he says some things positive, and they stand to the negative or to the sharp contrasts 3-to-4. So therefore, as an example, if he's talking about the fundamental nature of things, he'll say three or four things positive, and he might say on top of that 15 to 18 negative things or contrasts. Now, if you build up your view of what he's doing by the negatives, you miss the fact that his whole style is epigrammatic, right? And it deals with opposites and sharp contrasts. That's his style. So we have to see why he's doing that and the fact that he's doing it. And I have a couple of very good examples of this word, which we'll get to in a moment. All right? So now look here. Given this, we now have to take a look at this curious thing called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a term, right? Fancy word, used to describe method of interpretation or approach to interpretation. In the classic world, there are basically three. Now, the first is, like with Aristotle, there are some people who believe you can understand Aristotle just by staying in Aristotle, by Plato just staying into Plato. That's one approach to understanding the text. The second, however, is very heavily into the ancient Platonic tradition, and what it does is say, no, there's a whole tradition we can examine. And since there are many very fine thinkers who are exploring these early thinkers and important thinkers, what happens if we find a few really outstanding thinkers who can throw light on the early thinkers as example? If we want to read Plato, we want to get into Plato, and there are some difficulties in Plato, what if we went through the tradition of Platonic literature and got into Proclus? Well, Proclus is a commentary on much of Plato, especially the Parmenides and other writings. And then if we can master that and go back and to read Plato, then it should illuminate Plato. To the degree that it does so, that's the second method of hermeneutical method of the ancients. Now, Proclus talks about the fact that he studied with Cyrenius, who was a great Neoplatonist, didn't leave much in writing, if anything, fragments. But by working with him and understanding what he grasped about Plato, he was able to put it into a structure, and those are the works we have. That's a different method. Aristarchus is one of the great geniuses of the old days, and he did an exploration of Homer. He's one of the great authors on Homer. Now, what did that mean? That meant, therefore, when people in the olden days wanted to get into Homer and they read him and enjoyed him, they might want to then check on Aristarchus to find out what he says about particular issues, and then go back into Homer to see whether that illuminates things that may be a little obscure or difficult. Priscianus is another one who really has stated this method very clearly, and he did a work on Aristotle's De Anima, or the soul. And it's a very fine work. Priscianus did it. And in the introduction, Priscianus says, and he's 3rd century, he said you can understand the idea of the soul in Aristotle much more clearly if you read the writings of Iamblichus. And therefore, what he did was to say, let me show you what Iamblichus did with Aristotle's theory of the soul, and I will then add it and structure in such a way so that when you go back and read Aristotle, it will become clear to you. Now, the reason why I'm using Aristotle is because, like on the idea of the active and the passive intellect, there are really only 2 paragraphs, and they're difficult to read because the language is obscure, or they're only notes and they weren't really worked out. So therefore, Priscianus says, well, of course they were just notes for classroom work. Therefore, read Iamblichus, he'll put them together, he'll show you the insights and how to read them, and then Priscianus says, and I'll put them in a formal structure. Therefore, this is pretty much a statement of Priscianus's view. He says, before you do a work, an insight must be attained into the truth of the reality itself, whatever an author is talking about, the soul or the wisdom or whatever it is. An insight must be attained into the truth of the reality itself. And it must include one's own investigations. And those investigations are to go thoroughly into the conception of those who have achieved the summit in knowledge on that particular subject. So that's what he did, you see. He reached an insight into the study of the soul by reading Iamblichus. That's one of the men who, in the ancient world, was said to have achieved the summit of knowledge in respect to this issue of the soul. So Priscianus read him, mastered it, and included his own investigations in respect to that, and that's the basis of his work. That's the second mode of hermeneutical interpretation. And we did say there were 3. The third is what Plotinus and Sorianus does. They incorporate the work and use it as a vehicle for seeing themselves. It's not a scholarly treatment. It is opening up their own mind to this kind of exploration, and they are then the primary investigators, and then through their own achievements, they then see things in a sharper way, and therefore can be said to develop their own kind of hermeneutics based upon their own reflections of the text and their own inner experiences, and they try to bring it together to throw light upon ancient authors whom are most important to them. Those are the 3 methods. Now that we're looking at Heraclitus, you see, the modern way of doing things is the moderns have a hermeneutical approach, and primarily it's to go to Aristotle and find out what Aristotle thinks about Heraclitus, and then they represent that as the essence of Heraclitus. Therefore, we're going to test that later. And you're going to be the testing. You're going to do some testing. I have statements of Aristotle, all of them, from his work on Heraclitus, and after we go through this talk, you'll be given those sheets, and you can just grade Aristotle, because you will be then in a position to judge how well he understood Heraclitus and